So this morning, we are kicking off a new series, but it's actually not entirely new. It's actually a pickup of something we did a few months ago. We called it Communitas because we didn't want anybody to understand what we're talking about. A few months ago, we started talking about this concept of communitas and what it means, essentially, to be a people who are thrown together not for the purpose of just comfortable relationships, but we're thrown together because there is a crisis in the world, that we are between two places. We are a people who live between the first coming of Jesus and the second coming of Jesus, between the salvation of Jesus and the judgment of Jesus. And this is a unique space in which to live, and the people that we are gathered with and the way that we gathered is meant to be identified in this way. Today we want to talk about something very particular in the middle of this, kind of a central focal point, which is the table of Jesus. Now, I've shared it a number of times from stage. It's probably no secret that the table, in particular the dinner table, is a big deal at our house. It's a place of community and it's a place of gathering. It's a place that we really enjoy. Even in the most busy seasons, we've always been committed at least one day a week to gather around this table as a family. And we give thanks and we share something that God has done during our day or during our week that we are excited about him doing. But the table has also been a different source of community for us, a source of community that's been shaped by the other people that aren't a part of our immediate family that we invite around. And for me, I think this started, even though it's been a value for me and Janine for a very long time, for me this started with the example that my parents set. So many weeks we would have people around our table that just didn't have anywhere else to go. And there weren't any requirements to gather around the table. The only requirement is, do you want to gather around the table? Are you willing to be at this table? If so, then come on. Until we moved out of Michigan, we would gather at my parents' house every Thanksgiving. And we would our family would make up only about half of the group that was there. And we had to start meeting not just at my parents' house, but we had to start meeting at the church because my parents just kept inviting more and more people who didn't have anywhere else to go for Thanksgiving, yet should be a part of a family. And so our Thanksgiving meals, the epitome of the meal at which we give thanks, was marked by having all sorts of people that weren't a part of our family, and it was so fun. I mean, tables and tables and tables joined together. From that, we learned how to do what we do. We learned to just be open to inviting people who might not have anywhere else to go. And over the course of time, we've had New Age practitioners gather around our table. People who are struggling with their sexual identity and have been disqualified seemingly from the church have gathered around our table to be loved. We've had people who have been hurt by the church. And maybe they were Christians or maybe they weren't Christians. And they gathered around our table. And the only requirement was that they were willing to gather around the table. That they were willing to be loved. You see, at the table, beautiful things happen. And historically, there's something extremely significant about literally breaking bread together, literally sharing a meal at a real table together. Not just historically, but even psychologically. There's a few things that happen as we share food around a table. Now, here's just a few of the benefits. It's by no means exhaustive, but when we get a picture of what happens around the table through sharing food, a few things do happen to us. The first is actually a two-part caused by the very same thing, and that is, as we share a meal together, our bodies release a hormone called oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is more commonly known as the love hormone. And when oxytocin is released, a couple of things happen. The first is that the release of oxytocin helps create a sense of belonging in a person. It helps create a sense of belonging and familial closeness with the people you are around the table with. Oxytocin is also responsible for what we refer to now as emotional intelligence. Empathy and emotional regulation, these things are increased with the release of oxytocin, and oxytocin happens when we share food together. Isn't that incredible? All right, next. There's a decreased risk of substance abuse in teens that regularly gather around the table. Isn't that cool? Reduced tendency for overeating. This one's arguable. Certainly arguable in my life. But studies show that when you are intentional about setting aside time to break bread together around the table, that you are more mindful of what you eat. More mindful in both what you've prepared, because it takes more time to prepare the meal, but also intentional about being more than just eating. There is this sense of identity and belonging around the table, and so the byproduct of that is less overeating. All right, and then finally, in studies that were done, it was shown that gathering around the table increased a general sense of thanksgiving and gratitude. Now, this goes beyond a Thanksgiving meal. It goes beyond all sorts of things. There's just this general sense that when we gather around the table with each other, something else happens. We are feeling a sense of this belonging, and one of the results of that is that we just start to maybe even be a little bit more reflective in our own lives. We start to reflect on the things that we enjoy, and we start reflecting on the goodness of the moment that we're in. And I don't know about you, but sometimes when I cut into a good steak, I am extremely thankful. It's so good when it's been seasoned well and cooked in the oil. Right? There's this sense of gratitude that grows in us. And sometimes we as a family even choose to celebrate those things, and we say, okay, what are you thankful for? Let's just name it. Let's be a part of it, and we want to make that a part of our own sense of gratitude. Psychologically, gathering around the table and breaking bread together does something. Historically, it's even more so true. Historically, breaking bread wasn't just about a psychology or a biological thing happening. It wasn't about the effects. It represented something. To break bread with somebody meant you were now identifying them, and that it was like you were part of the same family. Contracts were ratified, covenants were ratified through the breaking of bread. There was a meal that was enjoyed. If you think all the way back to Israel's beginning, there was a meal that was shared in the presence of God at the base of Mount Zion. That meal represented a unity and a communion between the Father and his people. There is something truly spiritual, even more so than psychological, that happens when we share food together. And I want to take you to one of my favorite passages in the Bible to talk about this a little bit more. We're going to be in Mark chapter 2, but before we go there, and as you're turning in your Bibles, I want to share just a quick definition, a quick description even, of what communitas is. As we open up this idea of being at the table, we're going to find that the table, especially in the story in Mark chapter 2, is a significant source of what we'll be calling communitas. And it's important to grasp hold of this one principle about communitas as we go forward. I want you to hold this in your minds, maybe make a note of it. Scholar J. Derek Lemons comments that within communitas, individual status and goals give way to shared common interest. Hold on to that. Within communitas, individual status and goals give way to a shared common interest. We'll be in Mark chapter 2, and we're going to be starting at verse 13 this morning. Mark 2:13 through 17 says this. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners." What's interesting right off the get-go of this is that there's a couple of patterns that are pointed out about Jesus. The first one is that it says, once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. And a large crowd gathers, and he begins to teach them. This was a regular occurrence for Jesus. And what I find fascinating about this is that it's like pastors in ministry have made it their goal to see how big of a crowd that they can gather. Like everything hinges on whether we can gather a crowd, doesn't it? Churches will do all sorts of things to gather a crowd and gain an audience. And if maybe we can get people in, maybe they'll hear the good news about Jesus. You want to know what Jesus' gimmick is? He went out to the lake. He just goes out to the lake and people start gathering around him because there's something beautiful about the presence of Jesus that people just want to be around. Like when you really put everything else aside and you just spend time with Jesus, it's quite possible that we would really, really like him. If we could just for a second if we could set aside all of the preconceived ideas that we have about Jesus, everything that we've learned through seeing other people try to live like Jesus, and none of us do it super well, and so sometimes that gives people a bad flavor, and there's all sorts of reasons we could get an incorrect idea about Jesus. If we could just lay all of those things aside, it's quite possible that where Jesus goes, we would want to congregate. That seems to be a regular reality. He didn't have to draw them in with anything. He didn't have to do anything special to gain their attention, although special things happened when people gathered around him. That's just the nature of who Jesus is. Here's what I think. I think people gathered around Jesus because he was the most peaceful and loving presence that they knew existed. That was it. Amazing things happened beside that, but people they wanted to be around Jesus. So he goes beside the lake, a large crowd gathers to him, and he does what he normally does. He starts teaching them. Like he's not going to waste an opportunity, so Jesus starts proclaiming the message that he carries around with him, and most often that message was the kingdom of heaven has come. That's the rule and reign of God through the person of Jesus here in this world. It's like there's this intersection of God's dwelling in heaven and earth, and for a moment they're intertwined. That intertwining is in the person of Jesus. And so he says the proper response to this is to repent and believe, and people did. What I find really interesting about this passage, though, is that it skips directly from there to verse 14. He's teaching the large crowd, and then it just cuts away, and he's walking along, and as he walks along, he sees this Levi. Levi's described as sitting at the tax collector's booth. Now, we've talked a lot about tax collectors before, but just to refresh our memory, a tax collector was in favor with almost no one, right? Especially the Jewish community. Because as the Jewish community saw tax collectors, they were traitors and con men. They were traitors because they worked for the Roman government, this Roman occupation that was occupying the people of Israel and was over them and was subjugating them and ruling over them. They did not like it, and a tax collector worked for Rome. They collected taxes for Rome. So any Jewish person who took on that role was considered a traitor. And then secondly, they were considered con men because while they were in the position of gathering money, they would oftentimes increase the necessary amount. And they would give back to Caesar what was supposed to go back for the taxes, and everything extra would go into their pocket, and there was nothing people could do about it because they had the authority of Roman soldiers standing on both sides of them, making sure you do what you're supposed to do. So we have this description of Levi. He's a traitor and he's a con man. And that's who Jesus invites along. What's fascinating is Jesus just left a crowd full of people who were probably in much better social standing. They were a crowd of people that had gathered around him, and they wanted what he had. Yet Jesus walks away from the crowd, and he walks along, and as he sees it, he sees maybe what God is doing, and he looks at Levi, and he says, "Follow me." Not to the rest of the crowd. We don't have any description of that. We're not even certain that Levi was ever a part of that crowd. We just simply know that Levi is a traitor and a con man, and he's sitting at that place of business, and Jesus just walks along and says, hey, follow me. Now, follow me is code in Jewish circles for be my disciple. Jesus was a rabbi, and so follow me meant come and learn to live the way I live. Come and learn how to live life from me. Now, this was unique because normally, at the very least, you would look at that crowd that was hungry, the crowd that had already been under your teaching, and you would draw from there because there's probably a better crop of students, a better crop of disciples, a better crop of apprentices in that group. But Jesus doesn't do that. He looks at Levi and he sees with eyes of faith and he says, you are willing to gather at my table. And so he says, follow me. And what I think is really humorous about this is we see in verse 17, like if somebody says, follow me, I think, great, where are we going? Jesus' response, your house. You're throwing a party, all right? Sorry, verse 15. So Jesus told him, follow me. Levi got up and followed him. Verse 15 says, while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, right? So he's like, yeah, you're feeding me. I'm coming to your house. Many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. Now, this is significant. There's something here that it gives us a signal that what's happening is a little bit more commonplace than we might actually think. Like, it would be one thing if Jesus gathered with sinners and the Pharisees and everybody's looking at what's happening because everything is quite public. And they look at that and they say, you know what, you made a mistake. You probably shouldn't, maybe you didn't know. You're new to Jerusalem. You're new to the area, but this doesn't go. Like, you don't eat with the traitors and the con men. Like, that's just not how it works. Come be a part of us. Right? That might be the understanding, but as one scholar points out, R. Alan Cole, about verse 15, he says this. This verse, and what we'll read in a second, the biting criticism of the Pharisees in verse 16, seem to prove that the Lord already numbered many such tax collectors among his followers. The meal with Levi was therefore not an isolated instance, but chosen by Mark, the author of this gospel, as a typical example of the mission of Jesus. Why does Mark share this story with us at all? Because I think those who were paying attention realized something about Jesus. That Jesus did this sort of thing not just once, not twice, but often. Maybe so much so that this was his regular mode of operation. In fact, if you pay attention throughout the stories of the Gospels, you'll see it happen again, but in a different way. You see it with a guy named Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus, also, same situation. But Zacchaeus, as he climbs up to get a better vantage point as Jesus is passing by, Jesus notices him and he's like, hey, I'm coming to your house. He's a little bit more forthright with Zacchaeus, right? I'm coming to your house today. And Zacchaeus' response is he becomes a follower of Jesus. Now here's the fascinating thing that we're going to see through this interplay, something beautiful that happens. When people gather around the table, their social status as traitors and con men goes from being tax collectors and sinners to disciples. Let me say that again. People go, as they gather with Jesus, they go from being traitors and con men to disciples. Just by gathering around the table with Jesus. There's actually no change in the behavior that we're aware of yet. The only thing that has changed in their lives is they weren't gathering around the table of Jesus, and now they are gathering around the table with Jesus. Like, that's it. There's no behavioral change. In fact, we know this because as we get into verse 16, we see the question from the teachers of the law who were Pharisees. Verse 16 says this, when the teachers of the law who were Pharisees saw him eating with sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? You know what this tells us? That they are still tax collectors and sinners. They are still traitors and con men. Nothing has changed about their behavior other than now, when they go to Levi's house, Jesus is eating with them. And it's baffling to those who are in charge, which here is listed out as those who were teachers of the law who were also Pharisees. This is like a double title. This is like the people who are watching and asking this question were teachers of the law, which means that they understood the Jewish rules very, very well. And that secondly, as Pharisees, not only did they know them well, but they were extreme about them. Like if the Jewish law said to tithe this amount, they're like, well, we're going to tithe not only that amount, but this amount and this amount and this amount and this amount and this amount, and you should too. Like if here's the line that we're not supposed to cross, we're going to draw a line down here so that we don't even get close to that line. That was the Pharisees. So the key that we have here is that these are very extremely faithful people who are trying really hard to live out every rule that Jewish law gives them. These are actually highly dedicated people who see what Jesus is doing and they say, wait a second, that's not supposed to happen. You see, Jews were not supposed to associate with those who were openly living lifestyles that were in opposition to the law of Moses. The law of Moses, which said, at the very least, do not steal. What is Jesus doing? He's sitting with people who steal. And it's not like they stopped. They're probably still stealing, but guess what? Now they gather at Jesus' table, and they're stealing. Yeah. My instant thought when I see this is like, oh, that feels weird. You know, like if I have people that I'm trying to bring into relationship with Jesus, if I have people that God has put on my heart that I'm trying to show his love to, my thinking is that eventually they're going to respond and eventually they're going to change the way they live. Here is the scandalous truth about Jesus. We have no indication that he cared that they changed the way they live. Now, we know from the rest of Scripture that a life lived in response to Jesus does change us, right? We do become, in our character, more like Jesus. We start developing the fruit of the Spirit, and that comes into alignment with him. But the only prerequisite to gathering around the table of Jesus was willingness. That's it. In fact, here's the main truth about the whole thing that we're reading, is that the only prerequisite to gathering around the table of Jesus is willingness. That's it. The Pharisees weren't willing to gather around the table of Jesus. They weren't. Why? Verse 17 actually shares the perspective from Jesus just a little bit with us. Verse 17 says this, on hearing this, Jesus said to them, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. See, here's the truth about the teachers of the law who were Pharisees. They didn't recognize their own spiritual state, and because they couldn't recognize their own spiritual state, they weren't willing to gather around the table of Jesus. They were able to, they would have had opportunity to, but they stepped back because of the people Jesus was associating with. Friends, I grew up hearing about this passage, and the whole thing that was driven into my mind is Jesus is the friend of sinners. But what wasn't driven into my mind is I'm one of the sinners. I disqualify myself from the table of Jesus if I can't understand the depth of my own brokenness. I disqualify myself from the table of Jesus and miss out on the love and the grace and the mercy that is found in his presence if I don't realize that I am not healthy, but I'm sick. You know, there's some people out there, and my wife and I kind of joke about this a little bit because we have some family members that on occasion may exhibit some of these qualities. And, you know, it's like some people just really don't like doctors. You know? And it's like, I'm not feeling overly well, but I'm not going to go to the doctor because if I go to the doctor, something will inevitably be wrong. It's like, if I don't go to the doctor, then I'm not sick. Right? Have you ever met somebody like that? Yeah, they exist. Maybe it's some of you. I don't know. Friends, if you're sick, you're sick. It doesn't matter whether you go to the doctor. But not going to the doctor doesn't help you get well. You know who's willing to go into ER waiting rooms in the peak of COVID spikes? People who are really sick. You know who doesn't mind being around other sick people? People who know they're already sick. You know who doesn't mind gathering around the table with Jesus, with traitors and con men? Other people who realize they are traitors and con men. Friends, at my heart, I'm a con man. I'd love for you to believe something about me that just isn't true in my heart at all times. And it ekes out in different ways. But the reality is, the way I live, I'm a little bit of a con man. I'd rather you believe something good about me than the reality of my heart 24/7. I am sick, and I am in need of a physician. Though I would like for you to believe that I am righteous, I am unrighteous. Righteousness is all about relationship. It just means that we're not 100% good with God at all times if we're unrighteous. If I am righteous, it means that I've never done anything wrong and I've never broken relationship with God the Father. But if I were to let you believe that, it would just be giving you the appearance of righteousness. I'm not righteous. In fact, there's no one righteous, not even one. That means everybody that Jesus came into contact with is unrighteous, except for the person of Jesus himself, who, though he was tempted in every way, never sinned. And he gathered people around his table, and the key difference was simply willingness. Everybody was sick. Everybody was unrighteous, but it was only those who would admit to it. It was only those who would say, yeah, you know what, there's something just wrong in my life, but there's something that feels right about being with Jesus. There's willingness. Now, here's the other thing that I want to point out, is that there's something that happens here as Levi pulls together his community. When Jesus says, follow me to Levi, you would think that Jesus is leading him somewhere else, and we kind of joked about, well, Jesus ended up coming back to Levi's house, right? But that's just the point, isn't it? You see, when we say yes to following Jesus, he doesn't lead us to where he is, he comes to where we are. Jesus doesn't lead us to where he is, he comes to where we are and helps us become like him. Like, that's the whole point. And then when Jesus does that with Levi, we see that everybody gathers around him is just like Levi. In fact, it's probably the people that Levi regularly hung out with. It was probably his co-workers and the people that he was doing deals with, and everybody that was willing to hang out with a traitor and a con man. That was Levi's circle. And Jesus doesn't say, hey, Levi, follow me. Tomorrow I'm going to be back out at the lake. I'm going to be doing some teaching. Will you please bring the other traitors and con men along with you? It's going to be a really good message. Jesus says, no, the nature of your community is now based on my love, affection, grace, and mercy for your traitors and con men. Levi, following me is not about doing certain things. Following me is about welcoming me into the center of your table. It's about saying everything that is good about all of the psychological benefits and breaking bread is now centered on the person of Jesus. This identification that happened historically is now between Jesus and traitors and con men. Between the physician and the sick. They're coming into agreement with each other and saying, I came for you. And you don't have to clean up before you come around the table. You can just gather as you are. The only prerequisite is willingness. That is it. Jesus doesn't take us away from where he's placed us. He works in the midst of where he's placed us. And what we see from this is this sense of communitas. You see, we said earlier that communitas, individual status and goals, give way to a shared common interest. We see this happening with Jesus. We are in this in-between, this liminal space between Jesus' first coming and his second coming. And the Pharisees were hell-bent on these rules and regulations. And Jesus says, hey, just suspend those regulations for a second, because there's a whole group of people who are willing to gather at this table, but you're keeping them out. There's a whole group of people that would enter in around the table of Jesus if you would just understand the nature of communitas, that we live in between this here, now, and not yet, the salvation and the judgment. And Jesus says, you know what? Your goal is not to judge people now. Your goal is not to make people's hearts change. Your goal is to reflect my love and mercy and grace in every space where you would have me. That's it. Friends, communitas, when we create these spaces, all we're doing is reorienting our table around the love, grace, and mercy of Jesus. And when that happens, it changes who we spend time with. You know, there were some really good things that I kind of got in my head as I was growing up, and it's not something my parents taught me directly, but I kind of got this idea in my head that if I hung out with the stoners in school, that I would become a stoner. Right? And maybe that was true. I don't know. I don't know. All right? But what I wasn't taught was that a stoner becomes a disciple the moment they enter around the table of Jesus. That's it. Were they willing? I didn't know about the willingness factor. I didn't know about all of that. I just thought, my goal is to try to lead you to Jesus. My goal is to try to get you to change. But now I'm seeing things differently. My goal is to welcome Jesus to my table so that other people can experience his love, grace, and mercy. That's communitas. That is a family that is formed around the love of Jesus. That is a family that says we are suspending the rules and judgment of who's in the kingdom and who isn't. We're suspending rules we're suspending the rules of the old covenant and understanding that now the fulfillment of that is based around the person of Jesus, and anyone who is willing can gather around it. That's it. Friends, our responsibility now is to do that. You and I are called to invite people around the table of Jesus, and we have to remember that the table of Jesus is our table because he doesn't bring us to his table, not yet. He comes to our table. He comes into our relationships. He comes into those places where we would say, maybe you wouldn't feel comfortable in the church, but you do feel comfortable around Jesus. That's our role as people who are creating these spaces. The table of Jesus is where you and I recognize those who have been ignored or forgotten by the church. And we share a meal that binds us to the heart of Jesus in our world. It all happens around Jesus. In communitas, you'll find people who both love Jesus with all they are, and you'll also have people that gather around the table of Jesus just because they like you. That's our call, not to change hearts, not to figure out who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. That's not it. We're way off course if that's our understanding. Our understanding is we are in this in-between time, and we're supposed to gather as many people as possible because one day Jesus will return and he'll sort out who is the wheat and who is the tare. Until then, let's just gather them all around the table and let Jesus sort it out. It's messy, it's beautiful, it's wonderful. So what are some steps we can take to getting there? The first one is I'm going to ask you to learn something in your heart, and that is to suspend your judgment. Suspend your judgment. I'm not asking you to figure out, not pay any attention to what's right or wrong. That's not the point. Jesus didn't do that either. Even though in this instance we don't have Jesus pointing anybody's sin out, we have many instances where Jesus said, go and sin no more. He said, woe to you Pharisees and Sadducees, because this is what you think and feel. Jesus called people out all the time. But in terms of those who were entering into the kingdom and around his family, Jesus suspended judgment because the only prerequisite was willingness. In order to find those who are willing to gather around the table of Jesus, which happens to be our table, we have to embrace the reality that Jesus will return to judge everyone, but it's our job to gather everyone we can around his warmth of love until that time. That's our job. So we have to suspend judgment in the middle of that. Remember, the Pharisees could have joined in, but they weren't able to suspend their judgment in this space of communitas in order to enter into the meal. They weren't able to bind themselves in community to Jesus because of who was already present. Those who are in the kingdom of God don't always make sense to us, but it makes sense to Jesus, and our job is simply to invite Jesus at our table. We have to start with suspending our judgment. Secondly, we have to orient our table around Jesus. By table, I mean, both our physical table, but also the spaces that we create. The relationships that we live in, the spaces that we inhabit, the activities we do, these are all different representations of Jesus. We have to remember that when we gather around this table with Jesus, it's a simple moment of saying, when Jesus is present at the table, when Jesus is there, when we are showing people the love, it's very easy for people to go from con man and traitor to disciple, to apprentice of Jesus. The truth is, so much life change happens when we put Jesus at the center of our table that people will start being discipled, and all you did was live out the love of Jesus. Not because you're trying to get them to look a certain way, but because you simply loved them genuinely like Jesus loves. That will actually change people's lives. But it has to be genuine. I was reminded this last week that people are not projects. People are not mission. People are recipients of God's love, and we are called into that love. That happens when we can orient our tables and even the table of our own hearts around the person of Jesus. I don't know about you, but for me, one of the first things I have to do to orient my heart table around Jesus is make sure that I'm receiving his love. It's very, very hard to love people who are different from you and who are at all different spaces and phases of their life if I can't feel the love of Jesus. By feel, I don't mean this emotional high. I mean, if I'm not aware and if I'm not confident of Jesus' love for me and I'm always left trying to earn it, then I'm always going to leave everybody else trying to earn it as well. Do not leave people trying to earn a space at the table. Realize that when we orient our table around Jesus, the only prerequisite is willingness. In fact, I'd encourage you this week, at your actual table, at a dinner, or at a lunch, or whatever space you have, invite somebody who is outside of the church this week. Not for an agenda, not to try to get them to show up on Sunday morning. Here's the truth about meals, physical, actual meals. Do not practice hospitality so that you can manipulate somebody into the kingdom. Do not practice hospitality so that you can get somebody to come to church. That's not the point. Practice hospitality so that you can love somebody with the love that you've received from Jesus. That's the point. I want to encourage you, if maybe you just do one thing different this week, invite somebody around your table who doesn't know Jesus. And then finally, a really practical point that we can do together is to join a community. Community is what we refer to as these spaces of communitas that we're trying to pursue. Communities represent a larger group of people where we can start to belong and be known. A place where we can be identified, a place where we can see examples of those who are farther ahead of us walking out their faith, but also a space where anyone who is willing can gather around the table. Communities is a thing that we're trying to do so that we have models of just opening our hearts and love of Jesus to other people. That's it. It can look 1,000 different ways, but here's the beautiful thing. While we've given, some of you have gathered at our house over the last summer to experience what we've done in our own way of running a community, and that's just one example. It's not every example. It's not the right example. It's just our example. The exciting thing is next Sunday, as we gather and we hear about missions all over the world, we're also going to be hearing what God is doing in the hearts of other people that he is sending out to bless in our own community. We have 3 teams next Sunday that we are going to be celebrating what God is doing in their lives as they go out to start new communities. New spaces where people can gather around the table of Jesus, where they can experience his love, not his manipulation, where they can start walking in accordance with his grace in this in-between time, where they can experience the salvation of Jesus before the judgment of Jesus, where they can experience the kingdom of heaven that he brought now, but he will ratify and fulfill when he returns. That space, where we live as families of disciples who are gathered around the person of Jesus to live this grace and love out the best we can. We have 3 new teams that are going to be commissioned next Sunday, and we're going to be praying over them, and we're going to be sending them out. But then I'm going to be challenging you, and I want to challenge you now. Hear this. Start praying about who God would have you join. We can't do this alone. And even as we start doing it together, it's going to be a little rough, all right? We don't all know how to do this really well, but we're committed to trying to do it. That's it. We're just committed to trying to do that. Would you pray about who God is leading you to join in with mission? Some are going to be geared towards specific places, certain neighborhoods. Doesn't mean that you can't be a part of it if you're not in it. It just means that when they start serving, that's the people they're serving. Other people are going to be geared toward specific people groups, networks of relationships that they have, that God feels like, yes, you've put these people in my life so that I can love them well. Maybe God's asking you to join those people. And in the midst of that, we're going to find a beautiful space at the table together as well. Over the next 3 weeks following next week, we're going to be talking about what that space looks like. How do we love one another well? What happens in a spiritual family? What does that look like as we interact with each other? As we gather together in this communal space to be agents of Jesus' love, what does that actually look like in really practical ways? I want to invite you to return, be a part of those discussions, and especially to pray about what God is asking you to step into in this next season. Let's pray.